So if you grew up in San Francisco back in the 1930s, right, and you were watching the Golden Gate Bridge literally rise out of the fog, you'd probably make a very specific assumption about it.
Oh, absolutely. You'd assume it was a New Deal project.
Right. I mean, millions of people still do. You look at that colossal, just monumental orange span, finished right in the absolute depths of the Great Depression, and you naturally think, well, that has to be the WPA.
Yeah, the Works Progress Administration.
Exactly. It just, it feels right. But here is the crazy thing. Almost everyone who makes that assumption is entirely, completely wrong.
It's honestly one of the most persistent cases of historical mistaken identity in the entire American landscape. I mean, today we are opening this fascinating historical dossier compiled by Nick McKenzie, and it's titled The Boondoggle That Built America.
Such a great title, by the way.
Right. And what this dossier proves is that the history of American infrastructure is, well, it's incredibly murky. Like, we like to think of history in these perfectly labeled boxes.
Yeah, colonial cobblestones over here, modern skyscrapers over there.
Exactly. But when you look at the 1930s, those neat little labels just peel right off. They don't stick at all.
Well, welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. We are really thrilled you're joining us today because we are taking Mackenzie's dossier and setting out on a very specific mission.
A very ambitious mission, I'd say.
Definitely. We are going to untangle the messy, just total alphabet soup history of the 1930s New Deal. And we're going to bust some major myths about American landmarks that you, the listener, probably drive past or even walk on every single day.
And most importantly, we are going to test this staggering thesis from the dossier, the claim that almost no one alive today has not used a WPA project.
Which sounds impossible, but wait until we get into it.
Yeah, because we are talking about this invisible infrastructure that is woven into the daily life of practically every single person listening to this right now. I mean, this is not just dry history.
No, not at all.
We are not just dusting off old blueprints and, reading congressional records for some academic exercise. The WPA built the physical backbone of the country you live in today.
It's the world you interact with when you drop your kids off at school, right? Or when you flush your toilet, or when you wait out a rainstorm.
It is history that you can quite literally touch.
So to understand what the WPA actually built, we first really need to talk about what they didn't build. And the dossier anchors this point with a deeply personal image from the compiler.
Yeah, this part was fascinating. Nick McKenzie grew up as a boy in Sausalito, California, right up through age 10.
And for those who don't know the geography of the Bay Area, Sausalito sits right at the north foot of the Golden Gate Bridge. I mean, it is a stunning vantage point.
You literally have this towering engineering marvel practically filling the window of your childhood bedroom. It just dominates the entire landscape.
And because it dominates the landscape, it dominates the imagination. McKenzie held the exact same assumption that most of the country holds today.
Which is completely understandable. I mean, we tend to take all these massive, heroic public works from the Depression era and just casually toss them into one giant bucket labeled WPA.
Right, because it's a mental shortcut. The WPA is the most famous acronym from that era, so we just assign everything to it.
But the reality check here is absolute. The Golden Gate Bridge was not a WPA project.
Not even a little bit.
Not even a little bit. It was bond financed. It was built between 1933 and 1937 by its own completely independent entity, the Golden Gate Bridge and Highway District.
So no federal money?
None. Not a single WPA dollar went into that bridge. Not a single WPA worker tightened a bolt or poured a single yard of concrete on it. Just zero.
Wow. And, the psychological effect of this specific error is what makes it so important to our whole discussion today.
Yeah, it seems like a piece of harmless trivia, right? Like, who cares who signed the checks?
Exactly. A bridge is a bridge.
But that actually creates this massive historical blind spot. I mean, if the most famous, iconic landmark of the entire era, the one literally everyone points to as the ultimate triumph of 1930s public works, isn't actually the WPA, then it forces a really uncomfortable question.
Which is, what did the WPA actually do?
Exactly.
It completely destabilizes what you think you know. I mean, I look at it like crediting a groundbreaking blockbuster movie to the entirely wrong director.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, like, the movie's brilliant, it changed cinema, you quote the lines all the time, but you are fundamentally misunderstanding whose specific vision and whose actual labor put it on the screen.
And the real tragedy of that is, while you are praising the wrong director for the blockbuster, You are completely ignoring the actual masterpieces the real director was making at the exact same time.
Exactly. By misattributing the giant, shiny things up in the sky, we entirely overlook the quiet, essential things right beneath our feet.
We overlook the local schools, the municipal sewers, the farm-to-market roads, the retaining walls in the neighborhood park.
Because the WPA wasn't building monuments to conquer nature.
No, they were building the quiet facilitators of daily community life.
Okay, let's unpack this. If they didn't build the giant famous bridge, what exactly did they build that makes their work so incredibly ubiquitous today?
To answer that, the dossier pulls us away from the physical landscape for a minute and drops us right into the human crisis that necessitated this whole thing.
Right, we have to rewind to the spring of 1935.
And you really have to put yourself in the mindset of 1935. Like the stock market crash of 1929. That is old news. It's a distant memory by this point.
Yeah, this is year 6 of the Great Depression.
Year 6. The initial shock has completely worn off. And what has replaced it is this grinding, just soul-crushing stagnation.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt is in his second year of the New Deal, and the country is just still deeply, deeply suffering.
And the first wave of that New Deal relief from roughly 1933 to 1935, it had a very specific flavor to it.
It relied heavily on direct cash relief, right?
Right. The dole, as they called it. Agencies like the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FARA, were essentially just handing out money to keep people from literally starving to death.
It was absolute triage.
Hmm.
I mean, when an economy collapses that violently, you don't have time to set up complex employment programs right away. You just have to stop the bleeding.
But by 1935, FDR is looking at the system of cash handouts, and he is growing profoundly uneasy with it.
And it wasn't just the sheer financial hemorrhage of the dole that bothered him, was it?
No, not at all. It was the moral and psychological toll it was taking on the American workforce.
The dossier highlights this truly pivotal moment here. On January 4th, 1935, FDR gives his annual message to Congress, and he makes this incredibly stark, hard-line declaration.
He basically looks at the legislature and says the federal government must and shall quit this business of relief.
Think about how shocking that sentence would be to millions of unemployed Americans listening on the radio.
Terrifying, honestly.
But he wasn't saying they were going to abandon the poor. He was signaling a massive philosophical pivot.
Yes. FDR and his inner circle had come to believe that the dole was actively corrosive. Like, they genuinely believed that receiving a check month after month without providing any labor in return, it sapped a person's trade skills, their self-respect, and their fundamental dignity.
Which brings us to a really fascinating historical figure, Harry Hopkins.
Oh, Hopkins is such a crucial character in all this.
He had been a social worker, right? And he had actually run that earlier direct relief agency, FARA. So he knew exactly how the dole functioned on the ground.
Then he becomes the intellectual author and the absolute public face of what happens next. Hopkins had this defining, just unshakable philosophy. Relief had to be a paycheck, not a handout.
Hopkins understood the granular human element of poverty better than almost anyone in Washington at the time. And he famously summarized his entire governing logic with one blunt, undeniable truth. He said, "People don't eat in the long run, they eat every day."
People don't eat in the long run, they eat every day. I mean, it cuts right through all the abstract macroeconomic theory and gets straight to the urgency of an empty stomach.
It's so true. Hopkins knew that you couldn't just promise systemic economic recovery, 5 years down the line when a father couldn't feed his children that exact evening.
But he also firmly believed that the relief had to come in the form of paid work immediately to preserve the worker's humanity. It was about saving the citizen, not just the economy.
Let me try this analogy because I think it helps frame it perfectly. Think about it like a house with a terribly leaky roof in a massive rainstorm.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Giving direct cash relief, the dole, is like the government coming over every day and putting a bucket under the leak for you.
Right. It catches the water.
Yes, it stops the floor from getting wet today. It is necessary in an emergency. But giving work relief is the government coming over, handing you some tools, paying you a wage, and saying, "We're going to pay you to finally fix the roof yourself."
Both methods stop the floor from getting wet.
Exactly. But only one leaves you with a better, stronger house. And only one leaves you, the worker, with a sense of purpose and the pride of having fixed it.
The moral difference they were aiming for was profound. But, to make that pivot, to go from handing out buckets to organizing a massive nationwide roof repair initiative, that requires an unprecedented level of legislative and executive machinery.
You cannot simply wish an employment program of that scale into existence.
No, you really can't. And here's where the timeline often gets blurred in, high school history classes, but the dossier clears it up beautifully.
So first, you have the legislative machinery. On April 8, 1935, Congress passes the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act.
And the number attached, this is just staggering for the era, roughly $4.88 billion.
We really need to pause on that number because $4.88 billion in 1935, that was the largest single peacetime appropriation in the entire history of the United States.
It was an astronomical, generation-defining bet on this new philosophy of work relief.
But the act itself didn't create the WPA. Congress just cut the check.
Right, the April 8th Act just provided the giant pool of money. The actual creation happened a month later.
May 6, 1935.
Exactly. On May 6, FDR signs Executive Order 7034. That executive order is what officially creates the Works Progress Administration and names Harry Hopkins as its administrator.
So April 8th is the funding, May 6th is the agency. That brings up a huge logistical nightmare, though.
Oh, a massive one.
You have Harry Hopkins sitting there in May 1935 with billions of dollars and a mandate to end the dole. How do you suddenly turn $4.88 billion into the largest peacetime employer in American history, practically overnight? Like, how do you even process the payroll for that?
Well, you have to build a machine. And not just any machine, but a highly specific, intricately designed, three-layered bureaucracy that had to balance very competing political and economic interests.
They had to figure out who gets a job, what they are allowed to build, and who else they can help.
Okay, let's unpack this three-layered machine because the design of this system explains everything about why our towns look the way they do today. Let's look at layer one, relief.
Right. So the first objective was pure relief, but structured very carefully to avoid creating a permanent underclass dependent on the government.
The rule was that they would draw one worker per needy household directly from the relief rolls.
So you couldn't just have an entire family of 5 sign up and take 5 jobs, right?
No, it was deliberately targeted to ensure maximum spread of the benefit across the population.
And they paid them something called a security wage. This is fascinating to me because they deliberately chose not to pay the going market rate.
The security wage was designed to thread a very difficult needle. It was set higher than what they would have received on the direct cash dole, so it was an absolute improvement in their living standard. But it was intentionally, aggressively set below the prevailing private sector wages.
But why? I mean, if you have $4.88 billion, why not just pay them a normal, thriving private sector wage and inject all that cash directly into the economy?
Because if the federal government suddenly became the best-paying employer in town, no one would ever leave the WPA to go back to the private sector.
Of course.
The government wanted this to be a safety net, like a temporary harbor in a storm, not a permanent career path. They needed to incentivize workers to take private jobs the absolute second the broader economy recovered enough to offer them.
That makes perfect logical sense. So that's layer 1, relief. Now layer 2, recovery. This is the infrastructure part, the actual building of things. But it came with a massive defining caveat.
This is perhaps the most important rule of the entire WPA, and it really shaped the physical look of America. The objective was to modernize public infrastructure, yes, but they were absolutely legally and politically forbidden from competing with private industry.
Do not compete with private industry. What does that actually mean on a practical day-to-day level?
Well, it meant they couldn't just act like a massive private construction firm. Like, if a private contractor typically built giant suspension bridges using heavy machinery, steam shovels, and highly specialized union labor...
But the WPA couldn't do it.
Exactly. The WPA could not bid on or execute those kinds of projects. They couldn't be seen as taking lucrative jobs away from private construction companies that were already barely surviving the Depression.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because I have to push back on this. Looking at it from a modern perspective, this sounds absolutely insane.
It really does.
You're telling me they had billions of dollars to build infrastructure, but they intentionally avoided using the best machinery available. You're basically forcing inefficiency by design.
You are.
You're making the job deliberately slower and more labor-intensive, just to avoid angering private contractors. If I were a taxpayer in 1935 watching 50 guys dig a trench with hand shovels when one guy with a tractor could do it in an hour, I would be furious.
And the historical record shows exactly that kind of fury from a lot of taxpayers.
Yeah.
It was a massive point of contention. But consider the alternative from Harry Hopkins' perspective. The primary goal of the WPA was not to build a road as fast and efficiently as possible.
Wait, it wasn't?
No. The primary goal was to put as many human beings to work as possible with a fixed, finite amount of money.
So the road is just, what, a byproduct?
Exactly. The road is the beneficial byproduct of the employment. Think about the economics of a tractor. If you use a bulldozer to dig a foundation, you only need to hire one guy to drive it. Most of your budget goes to the company that manufactured the bulldozer, the shipping to get it there, and the fuel to run it. But if you ban the bulldozer, you can hire 50 starving men with hand shovels and wheelbarrows. The money goes directly into human wages, and those 50 men take that wage directly to the local grocery store, the local shoe store, the local butcher.
Okay, when you frame it as an employment delivery system rather than a construction company, it really clicks. The WPA was engineered to maximize human labor, not industrial efficiency.
Exactly.
The friction between the security wage and the non-compete rule is exactly why WPO infrastructure looks so distinct. You can literally see the human hands in the work because they were forced to use human hands instead of machines.
The hand-laid stonework, the manually graded hillsides, it's all a direct product of this exact policy.
That is just wild to think about. And that leads us to layer 3, which the dossier calls a cultural and white-collar layer. This is the layer that always surprises people who think the WPA was just ditch diggers.
It's incredible. Hopkins recognized that it wasn't just construction workers who were starving. The Depression didn't spare the educated class at all. What about the unemployed accountants, the teachers, the actors, the musicians, the archivists?
His logic applied to them equally. As he put it, they've got to eat just like other people.
An out-of-work violinist is just as hungry as an out-of-work bricklayer. But you don't put a violinist in a ditch with a shovel that wastes their specific skills and, frankly, ruins their hands.
So they created projects specifically for them. We aren't just telling you this. The dossier shows the sheer variety here. They hired writers to travel the country, creating incredibly detailed local guidebooks and recording oral histories of formerly enslaved people.
Documents that are absolutely priceless today.
Yes. They hired actors. Imagine a destitute theater troupe being paid by the federal government to travel to rural towns and put on free public performances of Shakespeare for audiences who had never seen live theater before in their lives.
We hired clerks to organize municipal archives that had just been rotting in basements for decades.
So you take these 3 layers, the relief of 1 worker per household on a security wage, the recovery through highly labor-intensive local infrastructure that deliberately avoids private competition, and the cultural projects for white-collar workers.
And when you turn that incredibly complex machine on, the sheer scale of what it produced over 8 years is just, it's difficult to wrap your head around.
Let's ground these numbers because the statistics in the dossier are staggering. We're talking about 8.5 million people employed over the life of the program.
8.5 million.
They executed roughly 1.4 million distinct projects. At its absolute peak in late 1938, the WPA was employing nearly 3.3 million workers at the exact same time.
Think about the payroll logistics of cutting 3.3 million paper checks every single week in an era before computers.
It boggles the mind, and the physical footprint left behind is even more astonishing. They built or improved over 650,000 miles of roads.
650,000 miles.
To put that in perspective for you, that's enough road to wrap around the Earth 26 times.
Wow.
And remember our debate about machinery. Almost all of that was paved entirely by men who were out of work a week prior, using hand rollers, pickaxes, and shovels.
They also built around 78,000 bridges.
Unbelievable.
125,000 public buildings. More than 4,000 schools. 130 hospitals. Some 800 airports. And 9,000 miles of storm drains and sewers.
It is quite literally the municipal backbone of mid-century America, built entirely by a workforce drawn from the relief rolls, using mostly hand tools and local materials.
But, when you have a machine that massive operating in every single county in America, and it is deliberately designed to be labor-intensive and therefore visibly slower than mechanized private industry, you are going to draw an unbelievable amount of political fire.
Oh, yeah. It was an immediate target for criticism.
It was a lightning rod, and that criticism gave birth to one of the most enduring political insults in American history, the word boondoggle.
The dossier points out that the word boondoggle surfaced during these years specifically as a shorthand for trivial, useless makework, and the opposition press attached a very specific visceral image to it.
The enduring caricature of the WPA was the editorial cartoon of the worker leaning idly on his shovel.
You can picture it perfectly. A guy in overalls, maybe a rolled-up newspaper in his pocket, slouching heavily on the handle of his shovel, staring blankly into space while supposedly on the taxpayer's dime.
Now, if we are adhering strictly to impartiality, as the dossier insists we must, and we really want to make sure we are not taking sides here, just reporting the source material, we have to look at this attack fairly.
Right, we cannot just wave away the criticism as partisan complaining.
Exactly. There were valid, structurally sound criticisms of the WPA from day one that any objective historian has to acknowledge.
Let's detail them. First, you have the political reality of how this was managed. The federal government couldn't micromanage 1.4 million projects from Washington.
It's just physically impossible.
Right. The WPA had to be administered locally, which meant it relied heavily on local political machines, city councils, and mayors to distribute the jobs.
And when you have a local politician in charge of deciding who gets a life-saving WPA job, it is incredibly vulnerable to patronage.
The charge was that WPA jobs were being traded for votes, right?
Exactly. The implication being, you want this paycheck to feed your family, make sure you and your wife vote for the incumbent mayor. That was a genuine vulnerability and a real documented problem in certain municipalities.
Then you had the unions. You would think organized labor would love a massive federal jobs program, but they absolutely hated the security wage.
Yeah, they felt that by having the federal government employ millions of men at a rate below the private sector standard, the government was effectively undercutting union wage scales and weakening their bargaining power with private companies.
And finally, you have the simple reality of logistics at scale. When you invent a program overnight that employs 3.3 million people at its peak, real waste is going to exist.
Real make work is going to happen.
There absolutely were projects that were poorly planned. There were indeed photographs of crews standing around with nothing to do because the hand tools hadn't arrived or the materials were delayed by a bureaucratic bottleneck.
So the leaning on a shovel critique wasn't entirely fabricated out of thin air. It was a reflection of real logistical friction.
I think of the leaning on a shovel critique like this. Imagine judging a modern office worker by walking past their desk at the exact 3-second window where they happen to be staring out the window waiting for an Excel file to load.
That's a great comparison.
If you take a picture right then and publish it, it looks like they do nothing all day. It captures a real moment of inactivity, sure. But it completely ignores the thousands of emails they sent, the databases they built, and the actual output they generated the rest of the week.
Exactly. Focusing on the guy leaning on a shovel captures a moment of logistical downtime, but it completely ignores the 9,000 miles of sewers being laid down simultaneously under their feet.
And that is exactly how the WPA viewed the criticism. They knew they were under attack.
Yeah.
They had a very specific physical counter strategy.
Their defense against the charge of boondoggle and make work was highly visible, highly utilized work.
You can't call it a boondoggle if the community is actively relying on it. If your kids are attending a brand new, solidly built WPA school, if you are driving your truck on a newly paved WPA farm-to-market road, if you are looking at a beautiful WPA mural in the post office while you mail a letter, it's very hard for a politician to stand up and claim the money was totally wasted.
That visibility was essential for their political survival. Because of the non-compete rule, they were steered away from the giant, isolated, heavy engineering projects out in the wilderness and steered directly into local municipal infrastructure.
They built the things that touched daily life.
Libraries, parks, local records, sidewalks. The defense of the agency was the undeniable utility of the object itself.
Which brings up a fascinating paradox. If the work was so visible and they deliberately built things in every local community so everyone could see and use them, why do people today constantly attribute WPA projects to entirely different government agencies?
That's a great question.
Like, how do we get so confused? If they built the sidewalk I'm walking on, why do I think they built the Golden Gate Bridge?
This is the crux of the entire historical misunderstanding. The New Deal wasn't just the WPA. It was an absolute alphabet soup of different agencies, all operating simultaneously, often with very similar sounding names, but vastly different missions, budgets, and operational philosophies.
This brings us to untangling that alphabet soup. This is the myth-busting core of the dossier, because the single most common error about the New Deal is collapsing all its agencies into one giant homogeneous monolith.
We have to separate the WPA from the rest of the pack.
So let's dive into some rapid-fire myth-busting. Where do we start?
We have to start with the biggest point of confusion, the one that trips up almost everyone. The WPA versus the PWA. The Works Progress Administration versus the Public Works Administration.
One-letter difference.
Exactly.
They sound identical,
Yeah.
but they were worlds apart in how they operated.
But vastly different. The PWA, the Public Works Administration, was run by Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior. The PWA was responsible for the colossal contractor-built heavy engineering projects.
The massive stuff that conquered nature and redefined the American landscape.
All right. So when we talk about Hoover Dam or the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge or the Grand Coulee Dam.
All PWA.
All PWA. Harold Ickes was a methodical, careful spender who hired private contractors. Those contractors brought in heavy machinery, giant cranes, massive earth movers, and specialized union labor. They built the monumental structures.
While the WPA, under Harry Hopkins, did the labor-intensive direct hire local works with men pulled directly off the relief rolls using shovels. So basically, if it's a giant, awe-inspiring dam that literally reshapes a mighty river, it is probably PWA. But if it's the concrete sidewalk I walked on to get to my local elementary school, it's the WPA.
That's a perfect rule of thumb.
The PWA is the stuff you take a family vacation to go look at. The WPA is the stuff we literally step on every day without looking down.
The scale of heavy engineering versus local community facilitation is the perfect way to separate the two.
Okay, next myth. The WPA versus the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps.
The CCC was an entirely separate entity. These were the famous tree army camps. It was a program specifically designed for young, unmarried men who were sent out to rural areas and federal lands to cut trails, plant trees, and do conservation work.
So they lived in military-style camps, completely different from the WPA workers who went home to their families every night.
Right. And the dossier wants to retire a very specific, stubborn myth here regarding the CCC, the WPA, and a project in Alaska.
Yes, the Metlakatla, or Annette Island, airfield in Alaska. It is frequently and lazily mislabeled as a WPA project.
And it was not. In August of 1940, two companies of the CCC began clearing the absolute nightmare terrain, the muskeg on the Annette Islands Reserve.
For those who don't know, muskeg is essentially a spongy, waterlogged, acidic bog. It is a death trap for heavy machinery.
You sink right into it.
Clearing it is brutal, back-breaking, physical labor. And this was done under a special agreement with the Metlakatla Indian community.
So the CCC started the brutal work of clearing it, not the WPA. And then, as World War II approached, it was militarized and finished by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers under Major George Shea Nold in 1941 and 1942.
It actually became a vital combat airfield, later garrisoned by the Royal Canadian Air Force.
Which, as a fascinating piece of trivia, was the first Canadian force based on U.S. soil to defend the American homeland.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but the overarching point is zero WPA involvement. If you want genuine WPA aviation history in Alaska, you have to look at improvements to places like the Cordova Municipal Landing Field.
It is a hyper-specific example, but it perfectly illustrates how easily credit gets shifted around over the decades. Once a project becomes historically significant, people just slap a WPA label on it.
Always.
Okay. Myth number 3, the WPA versus the PFAM, the Public Works of Art project. We talked earlier about the WPA hiring artists for the cultural layer, but not all New Deal art is WPA art.
This is a crucial distinction for art historians. The most famous example is the Coit Tower murals in San Francisco. People walk into Coit Tower, they look at those stunning, socially conscious, incredibly detailed frescoes, which are murals painted directly into wet plaster, and they immediately think WPA.
But the timeline doesn't fit. Those murals predate the WPA entirely.
The Coit Tower murals were painted in 1934 under the PWAP. The Public Works of Art project was a much smaller, highly concentrated pilot program that existed only from December 1933 to May 1934.
So it was just a test run, basically.
Exactly. It was the crucial experiment that proved a government could successfully pay artists to produce public works without it becoming a total boondoggle. That pilot program laid the groundwork for the WPA's massive cultural programs a year later, but the Coit Tower murals are not technically WTA.
And finally, the Ansel Adams myth.
Oh yes, Ansel Adams, arguably one of the most famous American photographers of the 20th century, did a legendary mural project photographing the national parks in 1941 and 1942.
And it is incredibly common to see his work from this period lazily attributed to WPA funding.
But the dossier clearly states he was not on the WPA payroll.
Not at all.
Not at all. His project was a direct commission from the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service, championed directly by Harold Ickes. It was a completely separate New Deal stream of funding, entirely distinct from Harry Hopkins and the WPA's relief rolls.
Okay, so we've hacked our way through the alphabet soup. We've cleared the brush. We know they didn't build the Golden Gate Bridge. They didn't build Hoover Dam. They didn't run the CCC Tree Army camps. They didn't paint Coit Tower. And they didn't fund Ansel Adams.
We know exactly what the WPA didn't do, and we understand the specific rules, the security wage, the non-compete clause that dictated what they did do.
Which brings us to the absolute core of Nick McKenzie's dossier, the infinite dividend.
This is where we finally evaluate the legacy of the agency. Now that the misconceptions are stripped away and we aren't distracted by the giant dams, we can look at the actual footprint.
The dossier presents a core thesis. Every American uses WPA projects today, paying an infinite dividend.
An infinite dividend, that is a massive claim.
It is, but the dossier outlines 6 specific questions to test this thesis, to see how ordinary Americans still use this infrastructure daily. Let's walk through them organically.
Sounds good.
The first question looks back at the genesis. What were its objectives?
We established that heavily in the 3 layers of the machine. The objectives were immediate relief for the unemployed through the security wage, municipal recovery through non-competitive local infrastructure, and experimental cultural preservation for white-collar workers.
Okay. The second question is the harsh historical judgment. Did it achieve those objectives, and where it failed, why?
This requires an honest, completely unvarnished scorecard. As a relief program, it was a partial success.
Partial.
Yeah. It served about 8.5 million people over its life, which kept millions of families financially afloat and physically alive during the darkest economic period in American history.
Yeah.
But it never employed more than 3.3 million at any one time, which was always far less than the total number of unemployed citizens.
So there was always a gap.
Always. The political reality was that it was never fully funded enough to meet the total crushing need of the populace.
And what about the recovery objective? The grand goal of ending the Great Depression.
As a mechanism to end the Great Depression, it was a failure.
A flat-out failure.
The historical consensus is clear. The WPA did not end the Great Depression. The massive, unprecedented industrial mobilization required for World War II is what finally ended the Depression.
Wow, okay.
The WPA kept people alive, it preserved their skills, and it built vast amounts of infrastructure, but it couldn't single-handedly jumpstart the entire macroeconomic engine of the United States.
Which is a tough pill to swallow for its fiercest defenders, but the history is clear. But that leads right into the third question. What were the surprising immediate outcomes?
The surprising immediate outcome was a direct result of that non-compete rule we debated earlier. By forcing the agency to avoid competing with private industry, by pushing them away from giant dams and into small-scale, labor-intensive local work coast, the federal government accidentally became the greatest benefactor of municipal infrastructure in world history.
That's incredible.
They built the boring, essential stuff that cities desperately needed but could never, ever afford to build on their own through local tax revenue.
Which seamlessly answers the fourth question. What are the lasting outcomes?
The lasting outcome is exactly that localized infrastructure and culture. While the macroeconomic recovery failed, the micro-level municipal investments became a lasting, compounding success.
They built the schools that eventually educated the entire baby boom generation.
Yes.
They built the storm drains that still keep our modern streets from flooding during a hurricane. They laid down the farm-to-market roads that physically connected rural America to the broader economy.
Let me try another analogy here to explain this infinite dividend because it's such a cool concept.
Let's hear it.
It is like a massive financial investment fund that completely, totally failed its short-term quarterly goals. They missed the earnings mark, they didn't end the depression.
Right.
But almost by accident, with the leftover money, they bought a massive block of a blue-chip stock. And that blue-chip stock, the local infrastructure, has just been sitting there in the background, quietly compounding interest and paying physical dividends to local communities for 90 straight years.
I love that. That is the essence of the infinite dividend. It failed in its primary macroeconomic goal, but succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams in its secondary municipal goal.
Exactly.
The fifth question from the dossier asks, what obstacles did it face, and how were they mitigated?
Well, we spent a lot of time on the patronage scandals, the boondoggle charges, and the union battles. The mitigation was almost always the WPA leadership trying to show the visible work, to prove the value of the agency through its physical legacy on the landscape.
And that leads to the final, buried sixth question, the one the entire dossier is designed to answer for the listener.
Have I used one?
Have you, the person listening to this deep dive right now, physically interacted with the WPA project?
And the dossier says the answer is almost certainly yes.
You might not know it because there isn't a giant glowing neon sign that says WPA on the sidewalk you jog on every morning.
True.
But there are ways to identify them in your own town.
Oh, absolutely. If you know how to look for the specific federally mandated cornerstones on your local post offices or high schools, you'll see the dates 1935 to 1943.
If you look at the specific type of rustic stonework in the retaining walls of your local park, or if you look at the murals inside a municipal courthouse, you start to see the fingerprints of this massive machine everywhere.
It is a profound shift in perspective once you realize what to look for. And this is a brilliant resource for educators, too. The dossier notes that students can actually use local historical registry data and municipal archives to hunt down these WPA landmarks in their own zip codes.
It turns abstract history into a physical scavenger hunt in their own backyards.
You realize that you are driving over WPA roads?
Yeah.
You might have sat in a WPA school. If you live in Dallas, you might pass under a WPA underpass on your evening commute.
You land at regional airports where the original grading and runways were done by men pulled from the relief rolls using hand tools.
It's everywhere. The ghost of that 1930s workforce is still literally holding up our daily lives.
Which brings us to the end of the WPA's lifespan. By 1943, the world had fundamentally, violently changed.
Yes, the United States was deeply engaged in World War II. The massive war mobilization, the draft, and the explosion of the defense industry had finally absorbed the millions of unemployed workers.
The crisis that necessitated the WPA was over.
The dossier notes that in 1943, FDR officially liquidated the WPA. But he didn't just cancel it or defund it, he granted it an honorable discharge.
An honorable discharge.
Yeah. It was framed like a soldier who had served their country in its time of most desperate need, who had held the line when things were bleakest, and was now finally allowed to go home.
It is an incredibly fitting term. The agency was officially dissolved, the vast administrative machine was dismantled, the security wages stopped, and the acronym faded into the history books, often to be confused with all the others.
But the physical reality of what they built never left.
And that is where I want to leave you, our listener, today. We've spent this time tearing down the myths of the giant bridges and dams to find the real, labor-intensive truth of what the WPA actually was.
We have explored the deep philosophy of Harry Hopkins, the absolute necessity of the paycheck over the dole, and the bizarre, beautiful inefficiency of men building a nation with shovels so they wouldn't compete with tractors.
We have established how this specific set of constraints created a localized municipal legacy that outlasted the crisis that birthed it.
So here is a thought for you to mull over.
The next time it rains heavily in your town and the water rushes into the gutters and your streets don't flood, consider where that water is going.
Consider that the underground storm drains carrying that water safely away might very well have been dug by hand through mud and rock by a 1930s accountant or a desperate farmer or a musician.
Someone who just wanted to feed his family that day because, as Hopkins said, they eat every day.
They built the invisible foundation of your day.
As you walk around your own town tomorrow, look closely at the cornerstones of the old brick buildings. Look at the retaining walls in your parks. Look at the sidewalks beneath your feet. Ask yourself that buried sixth question: have I used one today?
Because once you know what to look for, the answer is almost always yes.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.